Okay, so first question is interest on bonds, loans used to purchase buildings included in allowable cost allocation? Cost of building improvements, and then land is not allowed. So this is a great question because it's hard to understand some of the allowable costs that we can have in a cost plan. Interest expense is allowed if paid for by the general fund. So any building that's been purchased through a loan, you can tack on the interest expense for the year along with, you know, what used to be only 2% use allowance. We can now include the complete depreciation of that building annually. But the interest on that loan, just like we can write it off on our taxes, it's the same idea in government is, you know, in order to be able to get that building, we had to, you know, procure this loan, and we had to get, or we got this bond, we have these interest costs. They're administrative in nature because otherwise we wouldn't have been able to get the building at all because, you know, we needed to borrow to get it. And so that is considered an administrative cost. And so typically what happens is that if it's following a building, what's going to be allowed is to take that cost and spread it to the occupants of the building. So that's the idea about it. So the people, whoever sits in it, are the ones that are going to grab that cost and pay for it. You can also, when they're doing it on a loan, there's attorney's fees for contracts that can also be included in the cost of the administrative costs. And then in, you know, this whole building improvements, yes. So we do 2%. The old guidelines used to say you're allowed to do 2% of the original cost of the building. So basically it's a 50-year life cycle if you think about it. So every year you're allowed to collect 2% of the original cost of the building. So if you can think about some of these older cities and these types of things, we have city halls that were built in 1900, right? Well, what was the original cost of the building then? $100,000, right? So there's going to be improvements that go along the way, and they're going to do remodels and things like that. Those are allowed. So those, again, we grab the original cost, whatever that cost was. So even if it was built in, you know, 1950 and it was, you know, $300,000, we can grab 2% of that, and then we can grab any improvements and add them together. And again, it's the occupants of the building. What we cannot include is the land. And the reason for that is, if you think about it from the federal level, cost of land in California versus cost of land in Minnesota is going to be extremely different. So it's not fair to reimburse someone for living in an expensive state and taking away federal funding that's supposed to be comparing apples to apples. So they assume that in most places, and it's going to vary a little bit in terms of like cost of doing building improvements is obviously going to be a little bit cheaper in Minnesota than it is in California, but it's not so drastic like the land, the cost of the land. So, you know, if we think about all our dwellings, you know, the majority of our costs when we buy a house is really the land. Mm-hmm. The dwelling itself is not where the cost is.